Great, thank you. Okay, great. So yeah, I guess I can either start by giving a sort of quick overview of kind of what I had been thinking about in this area. Would that be helpful?
Yeah,
I think yes, whichever way you feel it would be useful.
Yeah, so I guess things I've been thinking about, and also jumping off from the future pandemics workshop, there was some really nice discussions I thought there around policy, modeling and policy. Well, I guess it was more science and policy. So I was trying to think how we could sort of make that a bit more specific to modeling, less on the politics, but perhaps we can come to that afterwards. I'm not quite sure how we, how far we want to go down that road in terms of thinking about that as a wider question. But I started to think around them sort of in 3 areas. So I think there's questions around who is doing the modeling and what kind of expertise, both who does the modeling and how that feeds into other kind of science around this. I think there was a lot of discussion around behavioral science, around the economic, those kind of things, the modeling interacts with those. There was then a lot of thoughts, I think, around like, how is that done? So what is the process by which the modeling feeds into the policy? I think a lot of the discussion was focused around sort of the UK, both how that's happened in the pandemic and how that has happened in other previous science feeding into policy. And I think there's probably some quite nice things to think about there. And then the other thing was around what exactly are modelers trying to do and what kind of advice are they giving in those situations. And I think there's some interesting discussions around, yeah, so an understanding of what the assumptions that have gone into the models, what kind of models are used, why those models were used, why those questions were looked at, those kind of questions. And then, yeah, I think those were the kind of 3 main areas that I was thinking about that I thought came out of those discussions, but it'd be great to hear from others kind of, I think, that, or what are the other main things we should be thinking about and how they fit together. Valerie or Dennis, did you have any thoughts on this particular area?
No, I suppose I've been mainly trying to think about the sort of earlier stages of pandemics and so on. So I mean, I'm interested. So this is how science and politics interact. You know, when you have a pandemic going, and I think it's certainly something we should address. But I have to say, I haven't been particularly thinking about it the last day or two, so I have nothing immediate to say. But
no, so you said that the discussions we had a few weeks ago were quite UK focused, but it might be useful to think whether there are different processes. I mean, particularly your second question about the process by which science feeds into policy, that might vary, and there might be sort of international lessons.
I think in applied terms, you know, from the scientific point of view, one of the things that's been most wrong with the handling of this pandemic, namely the way that every country has done its own thing, from ranging from some very positive to some very negative, gives a wonderful set of data to look at as to the whole spectrum of relationships between science and policy and action. So so I think absolutely, I think we shouldn't be UK centered. We should look at look across the world at how other countries have handled this. You know, I mean, sadly, I think the question to the UK is how come that a country that probably has the greatest concentration of one of the greatest concentrations of expertise and is still a very rich country. I mean, how it has been one that's at at best about halfway up the field, if not in the bottom half, in terms of the way it's dealt with it. Where I suppose just following that through, I have mentioned this before. There was a long article in the London Review of Books, which was, I suppose, came from a rather left-wing perspective, but it was seemed a lot of it was seen valid to me, that about how the hollowing out of public services had made a fairly major contribution to countries such as the US and the UK being so poor at handling it. And I mean, more specifically on the ground, you see the example of where I think 30, 40 years ago, when my mother was working in public health, it would have been natural for the contact tracing and all that kind of stuff to be done by people in public health, like my mother. Whereas now it's been done in a centralized, privatized way, which is to some extent the only, is almost necessary. I don't know, it's partly a political decision, but it's also partly necessary because the public health system is just so much weaker than it was then. So yes, I mean, I think in all countries, I think we've got to try and come at it from a scientific point of view of not, trying not to appear to be pro right wing or pro left wing or whatever, but still, I mean, if there are facts on the ground as to the way things are organized and handled, so I suppose the left right neutral way of putting this is to say that local and specific and on the ground action seems very useful for combating pandemics, and that a very important element in all is people's trust in their government. So I suppose to take an example, you might say that China's political system is not one I would wish to us to have anything like, but I still think that, and I'm sure there's, and as people know, there's corruption in China and there were bits of concealing things and so on. But on the whole, the people in China, I think in a sense, trust their government, at least in its, when the government says we are going to have a draconian policy of really stamping this thing out, the public were in no doubt whatsoever that they meant this, and by and large went along with it, and by and large it was a success. So I think that's a very good example where the politics absolutely is not something I'd want to imitate, but you have to admit that in effectiveness terms, it had a lot of the elements necessary. Particularly, I suppose, the local focus, again, it's done in an insidious way, which I wouldn't like to replicate here, but I mean, the way that, as I understand it in China, the government essentially has sort of people in every community, so that if you live in a block of flats in Wuhan, there's actually someone in your block of flats in Wuhan who's going to make sure the people are told to isolate and things like that. So it's very 1984, but undeniably effective.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting point. I mean, very important to think, particularly if we're thinking about the context of how modelling has been used in those different places, a bit broad in terms of sort of explaining the science behind decisions, because I do wonder if how much of it is the government just says do this and people do it, or much of it also is there's a bit of, and I've seen this here, of a real explanation of why this is being done, kind of thing. So we are doing this kind of contact tracing because we think this is an important thing in order to stop transmission, kind of thing, and a sort of.
Well, I suppose it goes along with the more you are at the libertarian as opposed to authoritarian end of the scale, the more explanation your population expects from you, doesn't it?
Can I put in one thing? And
yeah,
I agree with Dennis on this, but just a remark is that we should learn from Taiwan, which is the country doing probably, well, they were first to act. They are doing the best worldwide, I would say. Yeah. And I think it's a shame that even in the Jon Snow declaration, or countries like Japan and New Zealand are mentioned, and even scientists are so quiet about Taiwan. Yeah. Like, let us not be silent in face of an oppressive regime.
Mm.
Yeah, I mean, that's...
Yeah, and that's an interesting point. And I think that's an extreme of it. I think what guys could be talking about a place, but I think there's also quite a lot of that going on also in terms of like people are happy to learn a lesson from Germany, but perhaps less happy to learn a lesson from Vietnam. And that's kind of, there's a lot of politics that's kind of comes into that, that kind of thing there as well. So yeah, that's an interesting, yeah.
And I think Taiwan were lucky that they'd got this remarkable young digital minister in post just a little bit before this came along. Did you Audrey Tang? I mean, I think that, but also very much a government that was prepared to be transparent and engage with its population. But
could I ask? I don't know very much about Taiwan's response. So, Pieter, Dennis, what were the
Frank, if you've not come across it, there's Audrey gave an interview for the Institute of Government, which is, I'm sure it's, I'll look for the link and send it to you. It's that was back in May or something, and it was one of the things that floated across one's email, and I went and watched that and was really, really impressed, actually.
Mm. We did try to get her to come and give a sort of repeat talk for the IDP program, but she was too busy.
So I looked in some detail at South Korea's early plans, and it was partly having been very prepared as a consequence of SARS and previous histories. But yeah, the point about a politician or ministers being sort of digitally aware and that it does look important. I mean, in China, for example, some aspects of it are certainly major aspects as to do with the mechanisms of politics and government. But one thing they have used very effectively is data and just fast use of technology to, for example, the number of tests. I think I saw the number that it's about a third of the number of tests per head of population as in the US. And yet they've still had the success with it. And it's concerned with just where those tests are directed and the speed of reaction and things like that. That are kind of enabled by what is sometimes called artificial intelligence, but it isn't artificial intelligence. Okay, you could call it that if you like, but it's basically just good data hygiene and operations research.
I think this business of the number of tests is misleading, isn't it? I mean, if you don't follow up on the tests, you can do all the tests in the world and it's not going to make any difference. So
that's right.
It's really...
and they've done pooled tests and things like that. So,
Exactly.
But I think that one thing which done also was they were way earlier than any other country in starting to have some travel restrictions and testing people on.
I think I'm right in saying they stopped flights at least from Wuhan, if not China as a whole, on the 30th of December?
I think halfway January, but they were definitely way ahead of other countries. And indeed, they were very prepared.
Yeah.
But I think that in January, they have only closed schools one extra week or extended one holiday for 1 week, I think, which I think is impressive.
Is that right? Yeah, interesting. I think there's a lot of sort of good comparison to go on across countries and what they did. I've also been wondering sort of in terms of how much modeling was used in the different countries and how much that influenced some decisions early on. So rather than kind of looking around at what was happening or looking around at what other places were doing or sort of thinking about it, then there was sort of models built of what to do with imported cases, or models built of testing and tracing won't have any impact, and sort of if that line of reasoning was good, rather than sort of experience from MERS or experience from something else. I do wonder if there's things to think about there. But yeah, I think that's very interesting.
I mean, the preparedness is obviously sort of really crucial thing. Well, preparedness and what you were prepared for, I suppose.
Yeah. Yeah, right. Because there's all those sort of ranking of countries, isn't there? And, you know, that were pre this pandemic, and if you look at the kind of ranking of who's at the top, it doesn't really correlate necessarily with how well places have done.
I think it's maybe there's something to do with the thing of Taiwan and South Korea. There's something to do with experience being better than more effective in persuading people than any amount of sort of scientific conviction. I was looking at the Royal Society had a meeting which is published in 2004, which was sort of, you know, what do we learn from SARS? So I feel that, you know, what the exercise we're going through now, we're not the first. It's not the first time it's been done. So it's interesting to look back at that. And I was looking back at the introduction to that, you know, the people who wrote that, as Angela McLean and Bob May were among the organisers, I think, were very well aware that it should make us think ahead, and that SARS had been a relatively easy one to deal with, and that we were not likely to be so lucky another time. So, you know, there it is in a prestigious journal and a meeting at the Royal Society and all sort of in the public domain. But the countries that actually took that to heart, I think, were mainly the ones that were closest to SARS. I mean, I've, from this sort of framing, I mean, I'm trying to put things in a sort of challenge sort of way. How do you promote and sustain best practice in surveillance and early action? So pop that on there.
Yeah. Yeah, I think, and maybe that links into the other point that it was brought up quite a lot in this kind of discussion, was how much to put out in the public domain versus sort of how much is going on sort of behind the scenes and sort of presenting the evidence, so there's lots of people can kind of comment on it and think about it, rather than a sort of direct line to a government or a proposal. And I thought that was interesting, and perhaps something that would be interesting to look at how that's been done around the world as well, and those kind of things.
But that's thinking still though of what happens once the pandemic starts.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, but even before that, you know, as you say, that kind of look back exercise, if that was really put out there and publicized and convinced, you know, governments were convinced that was a lesson that had been and should have been learned, then, you know, that can kind of be part of the thinking. But yeah, I see what you're saying, that's more about sort of while we're going, rather than preparing for the for the next one. Yeah, and maybe if we're thinking about preparing, maybe there's sort of questions around how much, how kind of specific can you get with preparing? I guess, because if we're looking at places that have learned from MERS or SARS and those kind of things, it could just be that they were lucky that there was something similar enough that they had sort of got better rather than a sort of general learning. But I don't know. I'd have to think about that.
I think here Finland can teach us something. They have, if I understand it correctly from the media, they still have their preparedness laws from the Russian invasion in the 1930s with tons of medical material available also for people in up north and so on. And they do pretty well as well. Well, partly to they have a geographic advantage, I think, partly, but even in Helsinki, they did well.
That's interesting, yeah. And so that's okay. And was that stuff that was still actively being developed, or was just kind of there that people could look back on and felt familiar with? And that kind of
it's still, I think it's still active, but they definitely have the laws to have the medical supply always way above standard needs level. And,
interesting.
And Germany was a bit lucky in that aspect, because they were actually politically discussing to get their medical how should I say it? I lose the English word now, but they have a lot of material available, and they were planning on going down on that, but the political process was too slow, so they still had what
they were lucky. And presumably, I mean, I don't know whether it's luck, but you know, the countries where there's a tradition of face mask wearing have really been in a good position compared with somewhere like the UK or the US, I think, where it was poo-pooed for ages that there was no role of a face mask, no need to wear them, and so on and so forth. And it's only really now, you know, I was reading a paper yesterday, the latest sort of one on aerosol spread and so on, and they've got lots of pictures of you know, the effects of plumes with and without face masks, and how things spread in buildings and so on. So you know, you get a body plume coming up just through heat from each individual with air rising. But if you've got a face mask on, the plume from the speech, breathing, whatever, tends to go with that up and away, whereas you know, you can see when they have no mask, it's coming sort of forward. And then they've done things with, even with different sorts of speech and different vowels, and you know, you get bigger results from consonants than you do from vowels, and all sorts of things. And we seem to be only now really getting to the point where we sort of accept that face masks indoors might actually do something.
I think this is another bit of I'm thinking it's some kind of new sort of sod's law, that it's only when you're faced with very difficult problems that you actually learn something. And I think it's like a spin-off from this wicked problem debate that you know, we're having later in the week. That we've actually, now that we've got a respiratory disease where we think actually we might be able to have non-pharmaceutical interventions that stop it spreading, that we actually start looking at the detail of that and how it works. You know, I think, you know, we could have done this with flu years ago, and presumably we didn't, because we took it as you couldn't stop it. You know, it wasn't a battle we were going to win, so we didn't try and fight it. Yeah, so I suppose also we have the alternative armory, hopefully, you know, vaccination as so faced with trying to, in the usual ways, get R naught less than 1 with the existing diseases, but even with the common cold, because that's one where vaccination isn't there. Still, people don't seem to have put so much effort into this. So hopefully that's a sort of bit of lasting good that will come out of this, is a better understanding of aerosol transmission.
Yes, I mean, I'm sure it'll feed into sort of building design and
yeah, building design, that's super interesting, isn't it? I started reading stuff about that and how they're sort of thinking about what future buildings should look like, and yeah, there's a lot of interesting stuff there. Yeah, and I guess, you know, hopefully we've learned from this for the next aerosol one. Are sort of things that could be done, thinking about the next, you know, I guess it's sort of thinking like what is specific about coronavirus that we've learned, or what is sort of can be transferable to how do we get that out of early on in the epidemic. But I've been wondering a little bit sort of generally in sort of modeling theory. You know, we sort of at some point became comfortable with R naught. The overdispersion kind of came up as something that went into general thinking, and sort of asymptomatic transmission is something that had been thought theoretically and then kind of came up here. You know, like, are there other things that sort of the theory sort of, it would be helpful for the theory to kind of keep track of or catch up with as this is going, but that's probably outside the scope of something policy related, but yeah. I guess in sort of the preparation thing that I'm worried about was how to sort of get a number of voices to be heard, getting down this kind of groupthink kind of way. And I wondered what your opinions were on how that had sort of gone in the UK, and what you thought sort of could be done differently next time, and that kind of who's involved in these questions and who's involved in the preparation and therefore ready for to be sort of activated for the next pandemic.
Yeah, I mean, I think, I wonder if it is possible to think of a sort of, some sort of flow diagram possibly of sort of how a pandemic arises and you notice it and you start reacting to it and so on, distinguishing the parts of the process that are let's say where politics plays a part, but you know, you could see what I mean. So so for instance, I mean,
yeah,
if you think of the overall position, provided you fund the WHO adequately, and it may not be funded adequately in this respect, but provided you get a political decision to, oh sorry, the phone keeps ringing, cut it off, sorry. Provided your World Health Organization or whatever is reasonably well funded, then hopefully you can have a good surveillance system. You could be doing things like, in the future, probably a higher level of data monitoring of, so you can imagine that more people in high risk areas, let's say at least, like people in China who might be in contact with the wildlife trade or whatever, be just one example, that more virus samples are taken from these people and put in the public domain where perhaps scientists can look at them and say, hey, I've spotted that there's something or other, I work on, I don't know, whatever kind of virus it is, and I've spotted an increased concentration and some new strains of that virus getting into people, you've taken these samples from patients, and perhaps that's nothing to do with the disease they're presenting with at the moment, but I think that shows a danger signal that this is a virus we should look at. So you can imagine a much improved surveillance system as science gets better and the WHO is funded a bit better. And that's not terribly much politics, but what is politics is then once it gets into a population and the local doctors recognize it, they perhaps tell the local public health officials, and at that stage, politics potentially enters. The local public health officials, for instance, in China on this occasion, and probably in other epidemics previously and elsewhere, didn't want the news to get out. So they hold back on it. They think we'll only do something about this if it gets really serious. We'd really rather this didn't happen. Can we sweep it under the carpet? And so that's a sort of local politics as the outbreak gets going, and you need a system. I suppose you need essentially to reward people for doing the right thing in those circumstances. So politics comes in there, and then of course, once it is agreed within a country that it is a significant problem, you then get your World Health Organization may essentially be recommending you should restrict travel or whatever, and governments may be slow to react. But also, I think the more insidious thing is that that the ideally apolitical World Health Organization or whatever coordinating body you have internationally may actually pull its punches essentially for political reasons. I think, correct me if you take a different view, but I think the WHO was not sufficiently forceful on some things, and particularly I think it's almost discouragement of mask wearing seems to be something which probably has a scientific aspect to it, but where international action was slower than it could have been because the WHO was not sufficiently forceful, and I think that's a political problem. So what my way of putting that as a challenge, I'll pop it in the chat, is how do you give a coordinating body sufficient power to demand prompt action without it being subject to political constraints likely to impede it?
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. And
so that's a question.
I wonder which country. Yeah. Mm.
And then beyond that, we come on to the things which I think, sorry, Hannah, I'm stealing you away from where you were sort of starting off. Then we come on to the area you were talking about, which is the politics of the way that countries deal with a pandemic once it's got going. And there I don't have a single challenge because I think it's a complex situation and the problems in different countries have probably varied quite a lot.
Yeah.
Frank, you're being a bit silent, looking thoughtful.
Yeah, that's very interesting, and I wonder
your take on these things.
I think before you joined, Dennis, I was explaining I'm giving a talk in another a little bit later this morning, and to an audience of on resilience, to an audience of senior civil servants on resilience. So over resilience of networks and of systems, not especially related to pandemics, but obviously pandemics caused that to be high in their minds. Yeah, just to comment on the things that were spoken about there. So in one of the Royal Society initiatives in Delft, the data evaluation thing, one of the big issues there was face masks. And it was very interesting to see that. And Peter Diggle, Neil Lawrence, Tim Gowers and I wrote a short little blog item or something that I think Peter Diggle was going to put in the RSS or whatever, which was trying to capture the bit. The scientific clash, and it was a clash of scientists, was between a strong sense that you shouldn't really do stuff unless you've got randomized control evidence for it, RCT evidence for it. And you can see how that's ingrained in parts of the medical science community, because they've won so much from RCTs. You just learn that certain procedures in hospitals are actually beneficial or not, rather than relying on a hunch of a doctor or whatever. Now, against that is the fact that if you have to make a decision quickly without full information, then it's a decision theory problem where prior probabilities and an assessment of risk and that kind of methodology is important. And so you see the clash between these two sorts of mindsets, or two sorts of cultural backgrounds within the scientific community.
And that comes up in the vaccination trials thing too, doesn't it? Where there's quite a strong argument for shortcutting the usual cautious 3-stage vaccine trials, just because because you're doing the thing in real time, and time is urgent, isn't it? It's
yes, that's right. But I was struck by that in a body of, because this wasn't a politicized debate or anything, other than a very small p about how the cultures of medical science advance. But it was really quite fierce. It took a lot of effort to get the Royal Society was keen to make a strong statement about face masks, and did. And Venki Ramakrishnan went on the TV and made various speeches about it. In the end, when the final Royal Society paper was accepted by the Royal Society's vetting quality control procedures and put on the web, and I think that was influential in the debate. But to get to that point required quite a lot of trying to bring the community together, because you don't want to end up with a public row about this. Then that just makes it worse. So I think the face masks thing is an interesting thing. We didn't have a lot of evidence to begin with. The early evidence wasn't completely compelling. But on the balance of probabilities and the losses and the rough back of the envelope cost benefit analysis, it looked like the right decision. Let's see if I can find some of the.
That seems to me would make that's maybe that's we're in the wrong theme there, but I think it's important, and I think that
very interesting.
I think in the statistical modelling somewhere, I think the challenge there is to examine the relative merits of the established, whatever you like, randomized clinical trial approach to things, whether it's considering new forms of action or new vaccines, as against the decision theory where you have a problem that is very suddenly upon you, and where there's a huge benefit to taking action early, basically. So you're trading early action for the probability of getting it right, aren't you?
Yeah.
And I think that's, Valerie, do you agree? That seems to me that's
Well, I always found that the face mask being quite inexplicable, to be honest, because it's such a benign intervention. You know, for most people, it's not a big deal. I mean, I know it has become a big deal, but you know, it's something that one could do early on when there wasn't much else, and you know, it was going to do little harm and could do a lot of good as it's come on. It's been more obvious, but I couldn't really see, you know, just the sort of precautionary idea. Why not do it anyway, just in case it works? But so I've always found all this a bit incomprehensible. But I do think the idea of what's acceptable evidence for something, you know, scientific evidence would be a really interesting discussion to have.
Yeah, I agree. And I think it's actually probably a more general thing as well. Like early on, countries that decided to do travel bans, what was their evidence for doing a travel ban? You know, there hadn't been an RCT of a travel ban, but they sort of thought about it and thought, actually, this is something that we want to do, or quarantine, whereas other places weighed up the evidence differently or thought about the evidence differently, or test and trace, you know, the decisions about putting that in place as to what the actual evidence for that working or not was, versus it being something that you could do that doesn't have much of a harm, and therefore perhaps you kind of should do it anyway. So yeah, I think that's a really interesting topic.
Yeah, well, again,
and masks, I've also thought it's been quite interesting from a
no, you carry on.
No, you go.
Yeah, I was just going to follow up on the travel again from the point of view that I was arguing it a minute ago. Re face masks. It seemed fairly obvious that one should try to stop travel introductions early on. You know, back in February at half term when everybody was coming back from their skiing holidays and so on. But of course, has more of an effect, you know, that does then start having all sorts of knock-on effects on the economy in a way which wearing face masks doesn't quite so much. So but you, please, sorry, my internet seems, it's usually pretty good, but this morning it's playing up, so I keep sort of missing little bits. But
oh no, it seems to be bad as competition. It's been interesting from a modeling point of view as well. Like some groups basically, sort of from the transmission modeling, some groups decided they just were not going to model masks because we didn't know how much a mask actually impacted transmission, so they didn't put it in their models. And then you have a situation where if other options in where a model and there's something that's not in a model, like how do you kind of weigh those up? Whereas other groups like AHME kind of went very hard for the masks and said, if we're wearing masks, then this number of deaths will be averted. And I don't know which one's right, you know, but they're kind of, it's again linking it back to the modeling, they're kind of weighing up of the evidence for what you can put in models or what you can assess in a model. It is also interesting, I think.
I guess the problem with so much trying to put in the effects of NPIs in models is just, yes, you know, there's a parameter there and you can tweak it a bit, but the question is how much you tweak it. You know, do we reduce transmission by 15% or 50%, or, and at that stage it all seems to become very arbitrary.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah, I think that.
And the problem with the over-articulated models is that it just falls into the trust problem. I mean, apart from the fact that we, you know, even a collection of scientists, mathematicians may lose the ability to reason intuitively about a model that's kind of overcomplicated. That problem emerges much sooner with respect to communicating the results to people who are not the scientists and mathematicians. You know, if you can't give an intuitive explanation that allows people to say, okay, I can see why that might happen, then they're not it's harder for people to trust you. It's either absolutely right, because that's what this authoritative voice has told me, which is a very dangerous position to be in, because the recommendations are never that concrete or never that certain. And the problem is that as soon as there's any error in it, even a minor error, then you lose all authority, or you potentially lose all authority. So that communication of uncertainty and communication of the intuition for models is a very important thing, I think. The link between science and policy makers and politicians to have some intuition for it. Because I think, as Bernard Silverman was saying, it's very easy for one's value judgments to creep into one's model and advocacy of a particular policy, and that loses trust then if people think, hang on a minute, when I look at this, I realize that they perhaps don't realize to begin with quite how a value judgment is incorporated in a model. Perhaps we don't even realize it to begin with, but then as soon as the policymakers or the politicians perceive that has happened, then that just loses confidence in all the other recommendations. So I think communication of uncertainty is important, and I think modelling. Of course, this has been said 1,000 times, and I'm sure at the Newton programme there's been a big theme on this, which is just how you communicate uncertainty, and at every level, not just the parameters, but of the whole essence of the model.
Yeah, we had quite a discussion on that. I was going to say yesterday, but I think it was Friday actually. But anyway, in that, one of the sessions on, the whole question, not so much there of communicating it, but simply of actually allowing for it all in the first place, even before you get to the issue of communicating it.
Yes. Yeah.
But it really is crucial, and would go a long way to making people to get over the fact that it's not really that experts are necessarily disagreeing, but simply coming up with different values, each with their own large uncertainty band.
Yeah. Do you think that the uncertainty and the value kind of judgment are inherently linked, or they're kind of both a problem and somewhat manifest in the same way?
Yeah, good question. I don't know. Are they just inherently linked?
Because I think sometimes they come from, there is uncertainty, and within that uncertainty we're weighing that uncertainty differently, or sometimes is that right, we're weighing different parts of that uncertainty, or is it sometimes different parts of the outcome that are being weighed differently in a value judgment kind of to decide? I'm not sure.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think I was interested to hear Bernard raise that point. I think that's a really, really important point, and I think is perhaps coming to the forefront a little bit now, where there's sort of feeling of, well, this is the science, but then a realization that once you get to this kind of science, there is, and I think it was sort of assumed that was all on the politician side, on the politics side, but actually a sort of realization that does happen on the scientist side, and we have to sort of try and be as explicit about that as we can be. I do think that was an important thing to kind of try and get across within sort of preparation for the next one, that we some sort of way of getting people to think think about that within their work. And, I don't know what the answer is. But...
I don't know. I suppose part of that communication thing is analogies and whatever, and you know, sort of. I'm sure that some of our English our companions in universities in the English faculty will have a field day looking back at metaphors that people have used. Because you know, the metaphor of Boris Johnson of a mugger, you've been mugged, or other metaphors he's used have not been very good metaphors. Whereas the one of that goes down well in California about wood forest fires seems rather better. You know, that you can do better if you put out the sparks early, rather than waiting until it overwhelms you. So I think, you know, just which are the analogies which work well?
Nice.
Yeah, that's
I
interesting.
think the forest fire one, actually, if I look at it, I mean, it seems to be very pertinent from the point of view of the very sort of off and on sort of policies we have at the moment. You know, if you were trying to deal with the forest fire and it kept on springing up in little bits, you know, would you just sort of say, well, we'll just get those little bits so they stay little, and then we'll go and deal with the next one? Of course you wouldn't. You know, you'd make sure they were really out before you went and dealt with the next one. So it does seem to me that
well, except that maybe you haven't got the resources to make sure they're really out. I mean, maybe if you followed that policy, by the time you got this one really out, that, you know, 3 over there would have really taken off. So,
well, it's asking hard questions about why you're not being very successful at putting them out. And I think having a not very successful contact tracing system is obviously part of that, isn't it? So
yeah, I mean, there are a lot of, I've done a little bit on forest fires and been to various meetings with the fire people and so on. In North America and Australia, and there are a lot of similarities really, but a lot of it's, you know, there are limited physical resources. I mean, both manpower and planes and you know, fire vehicles and so on, one sort or another, and they're having to be moved around from one place to another. So it's not simply you know, there are huge logistical issues, as there, and of course in places like Canada, a lot of the fires are unseen because they're miles out in the wilderness. So you know, there's the issue of spotting them and so on. So I think it's a very good analogy in many ways.
And I think I think there's an analogy to be drawn between that and the quotes NHS being overwhelmed meme.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, the policy has been a major, it seems to be a generally accepted part of policy that we mustn't let the NHS be overwhelmed. We must, you know, we mustn't let the number of cases get to a point where we don't have enough ICUs and ventilators and whatever. But that's sort of perhaps rather obvious because it's so life and death. But we've failed to spot the analogous capacity issue in terms of just getting the numbers down and getting the contact tracing working, and, you know, the firefighting stuff. That, you know, if you compare, say, New Zealand, when they got you know, more sparks flaring up, because they only had 1 or possibly 2 resurgences at a time, there's no problem about resources, is there? I mean, they can in firefighting terms, if you've only got 1 sort of little bit breaking out, it's easy to control. It's when you've got 30 different little fires all over the place that resources, and we just don't seem to have appreciated that there was that kind of limitation on resources, which of course is a strong reason for taking earlier action, or in the case, or where you took it, or with the lockdown. You know, we shouldn't have come out of lockdown until we were confident that we had the resources to fight the many little forest fires we were going to get left with.
But I guess the other thing with the coronavirus is the fact that it is global, and so it's global resources. You know, with the firefighting, they would move their firefighters. You know, they borrow resources from California to fight fires in Colorado for a while, and so on, because these things were sort of seasonal, and you got them slightly different times. Whereas a lot of the problem with resources seems to be, you know, that everywhere wants them, and we can't.
And of course,
so.
Yeah, I fear I'm going to have to go in about 5 minutes, but yeah.
Well, I think I don't know whether she's done it already, but there will be a Slack channel for this particular policy challenge. So hopefully,
back again.
Touch.
I saw the.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's what we talk about. I mean, I suppose it's a bit the sort of the hindsight problem, isn't it? That, you know, when you look back on the pandemic, it's going to be, I mean, like I suppose in warfare, if you look back at the last war you fought and all those battles you lost, you can see how if you'd done the right thing, you'd have won them. And I think the problem with thinking of a disease X is, you know, we could get just the right system in place, learning the lessons from this time to fight another similar coronavirus outbreak. But what if disease X is significantly different? So we need to think of these things in real time, don't we? To are there lessons to be learned about how you deal with something which really is uncertain? So of course you're not going to take as obviously straightforward a decision as you could if you had the information that's going to come in later. Frank, thanks for coming in. I think I mean, if people could maybe look at write down some notes about what they feel are the half dozen best points they made, especially if they can be framed as sort of challenges, just a few notes or whatever, and pop them in this channel for the which I think is going to be called Channel 09 Economics.
No, it's 10 politics and policy.
Oh, 10 politics. I'm living in the wrong world, aren't I?
We do have 9 economics, but we also have 10.
Have we got right?
It's politics and policy, and I just looked and it didn't come up straight away. But if you look at our channels, it's there. So okay, thanks, Frank. So is there any more we should discuss now?
Hannah, was there anything else you wanted to say?
Did we cover the things that you thought about, or are there others?
Yeah, I think so. And I think some sort of other ways to sort of think about this, very clearly thinking about how to make something a lesson learned as opposed to this is how we should have done it better.
Yeah,
that's a really important to think of.
Yeah, so again, I think if we each try and put a few sound bites into the channel, then we might, second stage is we get them from several different people, we could maybe try and organize them a little bit, maybe into and she's gone.
Well, I mean, mine was dodgy earlier, but
I think Hannah's
been coming and going, at least as far as I could see. You kept sort of little cutouts and coming back. So, and she did say something about having problems. So I suspect. Anyway, yes. Did you I sent you some notes on the I can't think which. It was the estimation. It was the UQ one, wasn't it, where we had
Yeah,
that
perhaps,
discussion. Shall I post that into Slack? I just think we need to get some things up there.
No, please do. I think so. And
Just to try and get people talking. I was trying while Hannah was in this one to make a few notes. I'm not sure, but I'll try.
And I've got a few sort of points coming out of the environment and the human environment interface that I'll maybe stick an email to you in the first instance, Valerie, and we can.
Well, I would, yeah. I mean, I'm happy either way.
But I got diverted into thinking about this politics thing, came up with a couple of ideas there. So.
Well, the trouble is what I hadn't quite appreciated. I don't know. Actually, you're not still recording, are you, Paul? Can we stop the recording?
That's fine. I'll stop the recording now. Yeah.
Thanks. We didn't really want all the last